recording now. So, hey everybody, I am Aaron Pate. I'm the general manager with Calagaz Photo here at our Mobile store. And I know we have many people that are joining us from Mobile and also from over in Florida, customers of our Pensacola store, or you might have just found this event on Facebook and the post that we had on there, and this might be your first time meeting us. So I want to say thank you for being with us this afternoon. Big thank you to Tamron for supplying this webinar and helping us to put this together. Jeff Allen is here with us today to give the presentation. And then we also have Leo Calagaz is here with us as well. If you aren't familiar with us as a company, we are about the only photo specialty store left in the Gulf Coast. And at this point, almost the only photo specialty store left anywhere in the Deep South at all. We have a store in Mobile, Alabama, and in Pensacola, Florida. Right now, we are dealing with, as everybody else in the world is right now, some difficulties and some issues of figuring out the best way to handle having our stores open with the COVID-19 situation. So we're currently open on a limited basis, Monday through Friday, 12 to 5 p.m. for in-store services. We have a service area set up at the front of each store, so you can't come all the way in, but there's plenty of room for us to be able to assist you and help you with anything that you need. We're still offering all of our services right now, so there's nothing that we aren't able to get for you. You can't just come in and browse all throughout the store at the moment, though. These webinars have been a great option for us to be able to provide some education and just some photo experience and some different learning opportunities while we can't have live in-person group classes right now. And those will hopefully return sometime later this summer or as we get into the fall. But even when they do return, we're going to stick with these webinar opportunities as well, because it gives opportunities for us to have people like Jeff on with us without him having to travel halfway across the country and come visit us in person. So it provides a lot more opportunities. We already have a couple of events scheduled for June, and you'll see those come up on our Facebook page soon. So be on the lookout for that. And I'll give a chance for Leo to say something for a couple of minutes, and then we'll let Jeff get started.
Well, I can't say hello in just a couple of minutes. So welcome, everybody. I would also like to give my thanks out to Tamron for helping us put this on today, and also for all the participants that have signed up, whether or not you're going to see it live today or if you're going to see it recorded later on. So thank you for taking the time and the interest. We are, as Aaron said, we are open partially at both locations. Mobile, we also have a drive-up window as well as curbside. And in Pensacola, just call and they'll offer curbside there as well. So here again, we thank everybody for being here, and I'm gonna turn it over to Jeff.
All right, thanks Leo and Aaron, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. Just a quick reminder for those, as I used to say when I was in broadcasting, for those stations down the network, it'll probably run closer to 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll still take time for question and answer. Also, as you may be able to see behind me, I'm Tamron Tech Jeff on all the popular social media. So if there's a question you don't get answered, yeah, I did the same presentation for somebody else yesterday, and I got a couple of late questions later in the day. So we'll try and accommodate everybody, and I hope to keep you entertained a little bit and informed, and hopefully give you some inspiration to get out and have some fun and get some photos. And just one more reminder: shop local, please.
That's a great reminder.
Always a great reminder. You've got two great full service camera stores there with equipment and photo finishing, and they make prints. Prints don't have an off switch, and I think that's very important for your most valued memories. Don't trust your hard drive. Don't trust anything you store on the internet to be there in 10 or 15 or 25 years for for your family to try and retrieve and see what your photos are like. Make prints. They have great longevity for the for the everyday things. Still go into the stores, or I'm sure they probably have online ordering as well. you know, make the 4x6s, put them in a photo album like your parents and grandparents did. Otherwise, your kids and your grandkids aren't going to have any clue what life was like in the early 21st century. So I'll step off the soapbox there, but I think that's an important thing. And I'm going to quick share screens here and play from start. And through the magic of magic, it looks like it's working here. So anyway, we'll get started again, and just one more quick thank you to Calagaz for hosting us today. I did run into an issue yesterday. I'm a Mac user, and Mac did an iOS or an OS update the other day, and Zoom did, and it made for some incompatibility with Keynote. So I switched over very quickly to PowerPoint. It's the same presentation, but the fonts, as you can see on this slide, apparently bunched up a little bit on me. I apologize for that. The content's still going to be there, though. So, and I did a test run with it last night and had no issues. So, without further ado, again, let's get started. Again, if you need to contact me down the line, I'm Tamron Tech Jeff. And let's get started, I think, with your camera before we get to actually getting out and shooting photos, especially for those of you who are new. And it looks like there's a lot of veteran photographers joining us today, but I'm sure we have some people who are new to interchangeable lens and adjustable camera photography. So I just want to go over some of the basics and give you some reminders and tips and pointers. If you're very new, you may still have that camera in that green auto or auto everything mode, and it can be your best friend, but you don't want to let it be your best friend forever, because the camera needs some input from the photographers. So while it can give you great exposures, it can also give you perfectly exposed blurs, and that may not be what you're looking for. So step away from that, and if you're still a little uncomfortable with your camera, most cameras have what they call scene modes, where you can set it for like a head and shoulders for portraits, or a mountain, which would be for the landscape photography, or an action setting where you see like a running person, which would be great for sports and wildlife and bird photography. And learn from that. Your camera records all the exposure data, so you can go back and review your photos and bring up that exposure data either on the camera or even after you've downloaded it, and see the successes and the failures, and know what from that data. Back when I shot film, I used to keep little notebooks full of exposure information on the photos I'd made. So again, once I processed and looked at my my negatives or slides or prints, I could see what I was doing right and what I was doing wrong. So the digital age makes that actually easier for you. Flattens the learning curve, if you will. So, step past the scene modes, and I'm going to talk a lot about shutter priority, because I think that's my personal preference for wildlife and animal photography. I do some aperture priority and some manual where it's appropriate, and we'll talk more about those capabilities. Again, controlling the camera settings are important. When we went out to Tahoe a couple of years ago to shoot some videos and some stills for some Tamron tutorials, and you can find a lot of our great tutorials on the tamron-usa.com website. And we also have a new homeschool section where a lot of our webinars and content that we've posted recently are also stored. So all kinds of topics. It's all free. You can subscribe to our newsletter, and we're transitioning our newsletter also. You can subscribe to the basic newsletter, or we have 3 specific topic-driven newsletters that we're going to be producing. Again, it's all free content. We don't share your information anywhere. Other than maybe sending, we'll track where you're coming from, and maybe if we have an event in your area, you might get an email from us about that. At any rate, when we went out to Tahoe, the lighting conditions were going to be the same all day. As you can see, nice, pretty clear sunny day, but we knew that we needed to maintain a consistent shutter speed, consistent aperture, and also a consistent ISO, since the light wasn't going to be changing. And catching these snowboarders coming off the jump, we did some experimentation before the first boarder came down the slope. We knew we were going to need a high shutter speed, and past experience told us that 1,000th of a second would be perfect for freezing the snowboarder in the air coming off the jump. We knew that we're going to need a lot of depth of field, so we set the lens at f/16, focused about 1/3 of the way into the shot, and that gave us enough depth of field to carry from near foreground all the way out to infinity. And I'll talk again more about how to achieve the depth of field results that you want. And also ISO, we just adjusted the ISO until we got the exposure correct for what we wanted. And that turned out on that day to be ISO 800. So ISO 800, 1,000th of a second, f/16, bright sunny day. And that way, instead of having a silhouetted snowboarder, we have nice detail in the snowboarder and in their clothing, and pardon me, in the trees in the background too. Little seasonal allergy here. I apologize for my voice. I think I can make it through the presentation here. So we'll start with aperture and depth of field. And again, if you're new to photography, it's a little bit counterintuitive. The small numbers represent what we call the large apertures or large f-stops. So when you're at, if you have a kit lens, it may only go to 4 or 5.6 as its largest aperture, depending on where you are in the zoom range. A lot of more advanced zoom lenses and prime lenses will go much faster than that, and that gives you a couple of advantages. The larger apertures give you the ability to let more light in. So your shutter speed can be higher and your ISO can be lower. And the other thing that aperture does is control the depth of field, the area of sharp focus in your foreground and background. So larger apertures are going to isolate the subject, and the smaller apertures, when we go to f8, f11, f16, 22, and beyond, if your lens goes there, are going to increase the depth of field, increase what's in focus. And here's kind of an example of that. Again, not a bird in flight, but a great example for any of your photography applications. We started on the left-hand side, shooting pretty wide open at f2.8. And we're able to isolate that pretty blue flower in the background. You can see everything in the background is very indistinct. But as we began to stop down, the focus point didn't change. Focus stayed the same. But that piece of lawn furniture in the background, when you get to f11, f16, f22, started to become very noticeable, and it was taking away from the flower. So for a situation like this, you're able to use a larger aperture to isolate the subject. And sometimes for birds and wildlife or sports, or certainly for portraiture, that's going to be an important thing for you to remember. So again, get out in the field or even just in your backyard and practice with these techniques, so that when you get out and you're shooting seriously, you're going to be more comfortable with your camera. And being comfortable with the camera is a huge thing. I liken it to driving. When you get in the car, if you're a regular driver, everything is pretty much second nature to you. You can, you start the car, and, if you have a very new car, maybe even press that button on the dashboard. I learned to drive in a 47 Ford pickup, which had a push button starter also. So everything old is new again for me. But, all of those things in your car are very second nature because you do it frequently. Play with your camera enough, even if it's, again, just sitting in the lounge chair at night, watching television, or go out in the backyard or to a nearby park or someplace and practice these techniques, so that when you're doing more serious things, again, you have that comfort level and you're not fumbling for controls on the camera. Shutter speed is the next control that we want to talk about. And this is the fraction of a second or seconds that the shutter is open. Now, obviously, those higher fractions of a second, 250th, 500th, 1,000th of a second, are very quick opening and closing of the shutter. They require a lot of light to expose your sensors so that you get a good exposure. Some newer cameras even go well beyond that. I have a camera that goes all the way up to 1/8000th of a second exposure, and it's something that other than just for experimentation. I've never really used it because most of the things that I photograph can be photographed at slower shutter speeds. Now, the other day, I was in the backyard photographing some pollinators flitting around on flowers, and I did find if I wanted to capture like a bee in flight and stop that motion of their wings, I did need that 4,000th or an 8,000th of a second to really freeze that motion. But for most other things, you'll be able to work with somewhat slower shutter speeds. And here's some good starting points. Now, you might want to do a screen grab of this, or maybe pick up your phone and do a quick shot of the screen. I'll leave this up for a few moments. But if your subject isn't moving, maybe up to 125th of a second, and this is somewhat focal length dependent too. As you increase magnification with longer and longer focal lengths in lenses, 200, 400, 500 or 600, your shutter speed for even a motionless subject, because the magnification of the lens does magnify movement as well, you might need a slightly higher shutter speed, especially if you're using a lens or a camera body that doesn't have built-in stabilization. Now, most modern lenses and some of the newer camera bodies also have built-in stabilization, so that helps you be able to get slower shutter speeds and still have sharp photos. But these are general recommendations. If the subject's moving slowly, maybe up to a 250th of a second. For birds soaring, maybe up to a 500th of a second. And I'll show you in a moment the difference between this hawk at a 500th of a second, where it's this is a captive animal at a rehabilitation center. It can't be released back in the wild, so it's become a wildlife ambassador, and it was flying between two handlers, but it was still flapping its wings. And you notice at 1/1000th of a second, the shutter speed froze even those small feathers at the wingtips in motion. Now, if you're shooting smaller birds, their wings flap faster, and you may have to shoot higher and higher shutter speeds. And again, photographing smaller birds is a real challenge. So bigger birds are actually easier to photograph than the small ones. And some of the examples you'll see of the smaller birds are mostly birds that are sitting on branches or stationary. So at a 500th of a second, I photographed this eagle, and it was this was in Colorado where I live, late winter, early spring. It was an overcast, kind of trying to snow kind of day, and I could get a 500th of a second at a reasonable ISO. I was up to 1600 ISO here, and I was shooting wide open with the lens at f6.3. As you can see, that dull gray background is just that flat sky behind it. But I was panning with the eagle as it took off from the tree it was perched on to go try and catch its morning meal. And the bird's face and beak and torso are all nice and sharp, but those little feathers out at the end of the wingtips, as you can see, are showing some motion blur. Now, as a photographer, I kind of like that motion blur where I have a solid main part of the subject, but that little bit of blur, it just shows that the subject is in fact moving, and you're not photographing a stuffed animal and plopping it into a scene in Photoshop. So just a little thing. Again, photo editors like to see this if you're aspiring to sell your images. Something to think about. And again, it takes some experimentation and practice, and different animals are going to give you that result at different shutter speeds, depending upon, again, the speed at which they flap their wings. Now, another thing, it doesn't always have to be high shutter speeds. We at Tamron do a lot of workshops around the country and go to a lot of birding festivals. And this particular shot was made down in New Mexico at the Bosque del Apache Festival. Most birding festivals are 3 to 5, 7 days. Sometimes there's one up in Ohio that's 2 weeks as birds are migrating. And what you get is by day 3, you've shot hundreds, maybe thousands of photos of nice, sharp, crisp birds in flight. And by that time, you're looking for things to stretch your creativity. So this particular morning, we had the camera on a tripod, and we simply set the shutter speed down low as the snow geese were taking off in mass that morning. And so a 15th of a second, we have those sandhill cranes down in the wetland that are still kind of tromping around. They hadn't decided to take off yet. And it's funny, the snow geese take off about 20 minutes before the sandhills do. And just it happens pretty much every morning like that. And you start to learn about what the birds are doing and their behavior. And I think that's also a big thing, knowing when they're going to leave the roost in the morning, when they're going to return at night, and where they go to hunt during the middle of the day is all part of getting more successful shots. But here, just a simple long shutter speed, you get that beautiful abstract motion blur and just a different thing. You're not going to want to shoot hundreds of these, but it is fun to do once in a while, especially when you have large flocks of migratory birds like this. This was actually shot down near Cape Canaveral at a birding festival we do in Florida every late winter, and we were out shooting. And again, you get out when you're doing workshops, you're going to be out before sunrise, and probably you're going to stay out till after sunset and maybe go to classes in the middle of the day. But here we were out before sunrise. We had this beautiful color of the sky. About an hour later, a tornadic thunderstorm came through, which gave us a little concern, but the tornado was 10 miles north of us, so a miss is as good as a mile. But I had this great opportunity with just a few birds flying through my sunrise, and here I shot wide open at f2.8. Again, the light level was pretty low, but I wanted to get that beautiful saturated color from the sunrise, and I got a 1/160th of a second shutter speed at ISO 100, and this was handheld with a Sony body that has in-body stabilization. So that gave me a nice, relatively quick shutter speed with that wide field. So it's not, again, always about getting that close shot of the birds as they're in flight. Sometimes things like this is going to be the wall art kind of thing. As you can see, it's behind me over there, somewhere behind me. And it's a print that I liked, or an image that I liked so much that I did make a print of it. So when it's not on my little presentation wall here, it goes back up on the wall in the office. Understanding ISO is the next topic I want to touch on. Now, ISO is the acronym is International Standards Organization. And back in the 70s, there used to be the DIN in Europe and the ASA in America. And they were two different ways of doing the same thing with your camera's light meter. And basically, you just want to tell the light meter how sensitive your medium is to light. Now, with film, we had to put a roll of film in and set that once and forget it. So the International Standards Organization created one standard that's used worldwide. The lower numbers are going to give you the best sharpness, the best color saturation, the least amount of noise. Most cameras have a native ISO of somewhere between 1 and 200, most current cameras. And then you have the ability, as light conditions change, to move those up to higher and higher ISO sensitivities. Now, because that's done electronically, it adds what we call electronic noise. And sometimes you're going to want to experiment with your camera, maybe even go out and do test shots, maybe different times a day, take your camera out in the backyard and just shoot the same subject at a low ISO and then medium and higher ISOs. And then it gets later into the day, into dusk and dark, go to the very high ISOs and look at them on your screen, or maybe go into the store or at home if you print at home, make some 5x7s or 8x10s and review so that you can see what ISO you're comfortable with, especially on the high end, before you think it's too noisy. I'm not going to deem this successful as far as being able to shoot. The newer your camera is, also the better it's going to perform at higher ISOs. So again, here's some basic starting points. Again, you might want to do a screenshot or grab a quick snapshot with your phone of this. But again, those lower ISOs I'm going to use for bright sunny days outdoors or on a tripod. The medium and high ISOs like 400 and 800, I'll shoot daytime. I often go to 800 in daylight where I'm shooting fast moving subjects, just so I'm assured of having a high enough shutter speed and enough depth of field. If I'm shooting subjects in their environment and I want to include that depth of field to include the sharp backgrounds. And then as the light levels diminish, you may have to go to 1600 or 3200 like I did with this night sky shot. And a quick hint for night sky shots, I know this is bird photography, but since I used a night sky example here, the rule of thumb, if you want those pinpoint stars, you're going to probably have to start at 16 to 3200 ISO. You're going to want to shoot as wide an aperture as you can. This was shot at f4 on a lens that opens up to 2.8. So a faster lens is definitely preferable. And the rule of thumb is divide your focal length by 500, and that'll give you the number of seconds that you can keep the shutter open before the movement of the Earth starts to affect the pinpoints of light, starts to cause star trails. So with this particular shot, I was able to shoot 30 seconds because the math with a 15 millimeter focal length into 500 is 30.333. So 30 seconds was perfect. But if I was shooting a 50 millimeter lens, I would only be able to shoot for about 10 seconds before, again, the stars start to streak and cause star trails. So wide angle lenses are also very helpful for night sky. So a couple of extra bonus tips there. Another thing we want to talk about before we start shooting is stability. I almost always carry at least a monopod with me. And the beautiful thing of a monopod is it gives you mobility and it gives you something stable to set the camera and the lens on. With longer lenses, they'll often have a foot that you could put on the monopod. Use that rather than the tripod mount on your camera to save a little wear and tear on your camera's lens mount. But a monopod does a beautiful thing for me. Or for you. It takes that weight of the camera and lens off of my neck and back and shoulders, and I'm not all scrunched up. I actually have an old film camera with a classic Tamron 35 to 80 lens on it here, but you know, you're scrunched up like this, and if you're shooting for hours like in an event or or if you're just out stalking the wild animals and you walk away and you're hunched over and your back hurts and your neck hurts and your shoulders hurt, you think, man, I got to find a new hobby. So a monopod will definitely help relieve that stress and strain. Also a tripod. A tripod is going to give you the sharpest, most stable platform to shoot from. And another thing I like to use, especially if I'm on a tripod, not so much on a monopod, is that gimbal head, which is the item that you see in the upper right-hand corner. And the folks at Calagaz can explain to you what they carry in stock and help you make the right choices in a monopod or a tripod, or maybe upgrading to a newer or better one. Or if you don't use a gimbal head and you want to get a little more serious about shooting, you know, anything in motion, the gimbal head smooths out your tilting up and down, and it smooths out your panning left and right, and it's just a joy to use. Now, a couple of things I've talked about: stabilized lenses. If you have in-body camera or in-lens stabilization, do some experimentation with your tripod and monopod to see whether you need to turn the stabilizer on or off. If you're on a tripod and it's a good, solid, sturdy tripod, probably turn stabilization off. If you're on a monopod, you can probably leave it on. And with a gimbal head, again, experiment. If your lens has a panning switch, which a lot of telephoto lenses do, there are a couple of Tamron lenses that do, other brands as well will offer a panning mode. Check your owner's manual or check your manufacturer's website. And then the gimbal head works very well with panning, but you may find that you're better off and you get more sharp pictures by switching the stabilizer off completely. Again, with a tripod, and also that addition of the gimbal, sometimes it's better to switch stabilizer off. Also, stabilizers don't give you a lot of benefit if you're at a 500th of a second or above. I generally leave mine switched on because it doesn't really cause any harm, but if I'm going to be doing a lot of high shutter speed photography, I may switch it off just to save a little battery power in the camera, because stabilizers do draw battery power. So again, a couple of things, pardon me, to think about when you're out in the field. And one or two more things to talk about before we get into the images. Exposure compensation is something that I think is critical to understand. I generally shoot with my camera in its matrix metering mode, where it's looking at all kinds of points around the scene through the viewfinder. It's also if you have a Canon, it's known as evaluative metering. And then I'll use exposure compensation. And again, it's the comfort level I have with my camera and my workflow. I know how my light meters, I shoot mostly Nikon and Sony cameras. Their meters work pretty close to the same. And Canons really do as well. But the scene you see here is a light meter's worst nightmare, because you have a fairly dark subject that's nearly backlit. There's a little crossing light, but she's mostly backlit on a bright foreground. So the same thing happens when you're at the shore and you have that reflection off of sand or water, where you're shooting waterfowl. You're going to have these reflections off of the surface that are going to mess with your light meter. So again, go to your manufacturer's, your owner's manual if you like to read your owner's manual, or the camera body manufacturers have a lot of great tutorials on their YouTube channels also that'll tell you exactly how to make these adjustments on your camera. And usually they'll have tutorials that are model specific. So you may have an analog dial like you see in the center of the frame. You might have a plus minus button that you push. There might be something on the LCD panel on the top or the back of your camera that shows you those exposure compensation functions. But there's something that I think are very valuable to learn how to use. And again, you can see from these examples, underexposing by 1 or 2 stops or overexposing by 1 or 2 stops make for 4 completely different photos of the same scene. Now, if your subject is backlit, you're probably going to be most concerned, or if you're shooting dark things on a reflective surface or birds in the sky, you're going to be most concerned to going to maybe the +1, +2 settings. If you have a spotlit subject, a very bright subject that's in dark surroundings, like a light colored bird sitting in a dark tree, then you want to go to those minus settings. So again, go out in the yard or wherever you like to go to experiment and practice with your camera and get to know how exposure compensation works. And that way, rather than, again, in the field trying to fiddle around with going to a spot metering or center weighted metering, and only the newest cameras, spot metering is great, but it generally only reads the center spot of the scene. Now, my subject may not be in the center of the scene for composition purposes. So some of the newest cameras, as you move your focus points around, it will also move the meter point around. So spot metering is a little more valuable with the newer cameras. But if you have a camera that's 2, 3, 5 years old, the meter may not move with your focus point. So again, check your owner's manual and check your body maker's tutorials to learn more about that. Now, when you get out in the field, start experimenting. Zoom your lens in and out, move your feet. Sometimes a step or two to the left or right can make a huge difference. Also, don't be afraid to, I carry a little step stool with me so I can get a couple of feet higher. I also usually carry a tarp and some knee pads so that I can throw out on the ground, or just, I carry a gardener's knee pad, or sometimes like construction workers' knee pads. You can find those at hardware stores and home improvement stores and gardening centers. They're pretty affordable. Even like those foam seat cushions that you can buy at a sports store that you would take to the stadium are great, and they're a little bit bigger than the gardening knee pads to throw out and again kneel down on, because I do shoot sometimes from low angles, and that's important too. Change your angle of view. Don't look at the world all the time from your normal standing height. Get higher or lower to change the composition. Provide some environment for your subject, and of course change your apertures and depth of field to see where you want to be with your subject's emphasis, whether you want to show just the sharp subject with a soft background, or if you want to show that sharp subject in their environment. Think about, and I used to, we've all probably heard of the rule of thirds. I'm calling it the suggestion of thirds, because it's really hard to nail an exactly a 1/3 in from the side and from the top or the bottom. But if you can get your compositions to where you're thinking about composing not smack dab in the middle, but a little off center, it makes the compositions a little more interesting. Groups of 3 items or subjects can make for a more interesting photo. Leading lines, diagonal or geometric shapes help too. So those are some things to think about. And leading lines can be like a fence post or a road or even a tall, long bird's neck leading up to a photo of the animal's head can be very helpful. And then when you get out into the field, know your location, especially if you're going to parks. They may border up against private land. So again, of course, just common courtesy, don't cross fences without permission, those sorts of things. Know where you can and can't go, just as, you know, I have a background in newspaper photography. Sports photographers are generally assigned to a spot on the field. They've got maybe a foot or two that they can move forward or backward or left or right during different parts of a game, and they're generally not allowed to move around. And that's why, you know, again, when I was working for a newspaper, we had 12 people on staff, and on you know, NFL Sunday, there would be 8 to 10 of us out covering the game from different parts of the field because we were assigned to different places. So again, think about your locations and then know your subject, of course. Read up on the birds that you're stalking, learn about their habits, or just go out in the field and observe their habits, and you're going to be more successful. Here's a great example of that. I live in northern Colorado, and within 10 minutes of my house, there's this fantastic wetland area that these blue herons come to every afternoon to go hunting for dinner, so to speak. And they roost a couple of miles the other direction. So they've got a relatively large area that they're working for their food. And this situation, I had been, this is a couple of years old, but I keep it in the presentation because it's kind of a cool shot, and I'll explain more about how I got it. But I'd been going out for weeks, and I'd seen these herons, and this wetland is right off of a busy county road. And as soon as I'd pull off the pavement, hit the gravel, sometimes I would spook or startle the birds, and they would leave or move or change their behavior. Another thing, when you're photographing wild animals, if you're, you know, large mammals, bison, elk, deer, you want to stay 25 yards away from you. If you ever go to a national park, that's what the rangers will tell you. Things that could bite you, like wolves, you know, you want to stay maybe 100 yards away. Again, that's the national parks recommendations. But even for birds and smaller animals, if you're getting close enough to them that you're altering their behavior, you're too close. And do them a favor, do yourself a favor. They're going to act more naturally if they're not feeling threatened by you. So that's an important thing to remember. And anyway, to get this shot, I finally realized I needed to get there before the birds did. So I got to their feeding ground there, this wetland area, one afternoon, about 30 minutes before I'd been arriving, and as luck would have it, the birds hadn't gotten there yet. So I was able to set up and set my exposure. As you can see, it's a very backlit scene, so I was experimenting with my exposure. I ended up with an exposure compensation of plus 1.3 stops because I knew I was going to be photographing a backlit bird, and I photographed those dead fallen reeds to determine that. Fairly bright day. I was at ISO 400, and I determined that I was going to have a 1/320th of a second shutter speed. And using the VC stabilization, I was handheld and I was panning with the birds. So when I saw the heron start to fly toward me, I racked the lens all the way out at 600 millimeters, and it's still at 600 millimeters here, but they were just specks in the sky at that point. And I allowed the camera to lock focus. Now, here's another thing I do. I use either a single point focus that I can move around, or I use that small group focus. Some people are very successful with larger focus point patterns, but I find that I lose focus more often than if I'm just using single point or small groups. So at least for my camera situation, that's how I found it works best. So acquired focus, I shoot my camera on continuous frame advance always if I'm shooting moving subjects, so that when I fire the button, it goes click, 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 click. I'm also shooting in continuous focus. Again, the Canon users, that's going to be AI servo. And again, you can experiment with this on your cameras, but continuous focus and continuous frame advance are going to give me the maximum ability to get the shot that I'm envisioning. And started firing as the birds got closer and closer. And this is one of about 6 shots where it's flying and landing very near me. Now, the other thing that happened was I had some nice light reflecting up from underneath it, so I knew that that was going to happen because those dead cattails were reflecting the light back up, or those dead reeds. So I was going to get a nice exposure of the underside of the bird, and I got very lucky. As if you've ever seen a great blue heron, you know that's not its natural color. That simply happened. This isn't Photoshop. That blue color happened as it was flapping its wings. They have oil in their feathers, and the oil in the feathers reflected the blue light from the sky in that particular frame. Didn't happen the frame before, the frame after, and I could probably go out and shoot another 1,000 pictures and not get that exact reflection again, but I got that very cool blue look in the bird's feathers. So again, that's one of the things that kind of made this shot a keeper. So you know, a lot of planning and a lot of preparation went in. And you know, again, at the end, it turned out some luck was involved too. And sometimes that'll happen in your photography. This is down at a bird festival that Tamron attends every year in New Mexico in November, called it's at the Bosque del Apache Wildlife Reserve, and you'll see a number of photos that I've shot there over the years. This was shot with a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. And another thing to know about birds is we learn to fly from watching birds. So airplanes take off into the wind. Guess what? We learned that because birds take off into the wind. So this particular morning, the wind was at my back. So I knew the birds were going to take off right over me. Another pro tip: always when you're out shooting waterfowl like this, these are snow geese, wear a hat and wear some sort of waterproof jacket. So as the water drips off of them, you're not getting pond water all over you. And also, birds do what birds do when they take off, and they'll squirt out the back end too. And there were people around me. I didn't get hit by bird dew, but other people did. So again, never a bad idea to wear a hat and a jacket so that you're not rushing back to the hotel and washing your hair or something, or you know, trying to find a towel in the back of the car to rub out the soil. So that's important to think about. Here again, the sun was fairly high up in the sky, but I was still at ISO 800 f14. So I was able to carry a little bit of depth of field. And if you notice, the birds closest to the camera in that frame are starting to go out of focus. And I just like the composition of this shot and where everybody was in the frame. But also notice that I was only at 150 millimeters here, and I was fairly close to the wetland. You'll see that cottonwood tree in the background is fairly large. Now, a day or so later, and I don't remember whether this was a day before or the day after, again, the wind was blowing a different direction, so the birds were taking off toward camera left into the wind there, but I was using the 150 to 600. I was actually substantially further back. I was probably 30 or 40 feet further back, but the compression, and this was at about 500 millimeters, the compression of that telephoto lens makes that tree look much larger in the scene. Again, slightly different time of day, slightly different light. But again, think about the lens that you're using, and especially telephotos compress, not only magnify your subject, but compress and magnify things in the distance. So watch those foreground and background relationships in that way too. Thinking compositionally again, I had this single sandhill crane flying aloft, but again, I was able to use some background landscape, even though it's out of focus, that broke up the frame a little bit. It added a little anchor to the frame, and sometimes with single birds, if you can keep your foreground or maybe the tree canopy in part of the shot, just adds a little bit of anchor point. Now, you don't always have to do this. Again, this was down in Florida on the East Coast. We found one morning a family of osprey, or a group of osprey, that were circling a pond. And one after the other, it was like control tower time. They would dive in. One of them would catch a fish and fly back off toward their nesting area, which was probably a half a mile or so away. So everybody was catching breakfast, and I happened to catch this particular osprey, 30 or 40 feet off the ground as it was flying back to the nest to take breakfast home to eat, or to the, it was probably late enough in the year for them to have babies that had already hatched. The baby osprey are just starting to hatch here in Colorado this week. That was kind of a neat shot, and that's a good way to isolate the subject. Now, also, you'll notice on most of my shots, there's a gap between the subject and the edge of the frame, and you want to try and give your subject some leading room like that. Leave a little blank space, crop a little loose. You can always close it up in post. That's one of the few things I do in post. I try and do everything I can in the field, including cropping and composition, but I will shoot a little bit loose to allow that extra gap to give the feeling that the subject visually on a two-dimensional object, a printer on your computer screen, looks like it's not smacking into the edge of the frame. And again, that's just a little compositional cue that I've learned over time. The time of day can make a big difference in the light conditions you have. Frame on left is early morning, and you're always going to get that nice warm light early or late in the day. I found that early morning light tends to be a little softer. Now, also, it's coming from different direction. The light was almost straight at my back in the left-hand frame in that early morning shot. So I had, again, fairly flat light. So you have to have something interesting, like one bird's wings were up, the next bird's wings were down. So it added some interest to the shot. The light in the late afternoon, which we had on the right-hand shot, tends to be a little harsher, a little contrastier, and a little warmer also, because there's more particulate matter in the air. Hot air balloons launch in the morning because there's calm winds. In the afternoon, the winds have come up more. They tend to kick up dust and dirt and particulate matter. Also, as humans are moving around, there's more pollution in the air. So you get great warm light both times a day, but it's definitely different early and late. And again, here I was able to take advantage of some more crossing light. So I had that more portrait light effect. You'll notice even on me, I've got one side lit darker than the other side here. And again, you think about that in portrait lighting. I do the same thing. I'm trying to find that good light when I'm out in the field too. Broad daylight, you hope to find a subject that's going to give you a great shot like this. Now, again, this is a little North American kestrel, the smallest of the falcons. It's a fairly tiny bird, all things considered, not much bigger than a fat robin, but they fly incredibly fast. So I found my best results of kestrels are those that are perching on a branch and looking for their afternoon meal. And again, midday you can get some great results. You just have to be more concerned about subject placement and having again, like a smaller bird like this in a branch or something where it's going to be more intriguing. Also, if you get under the canopy of trees in daylight, you're going to need higher ISO, and you're probably also going to need to consider custom white balance. Again, the folks at Calagaz can explain to you how that works, and they probably have a number of different tools that they can show you to use or that you can invest in for getting custom white balance. And the reason is, if you leave your camera in auto white balance, or even if you switch it to the shade or overcast day mode, the green from the trees is going to give you a green overall cast in your scene. So a custom white balance here is also important. Also, a little compositional cue. You'll notice that the branch kind of doesn't quite hit the corner on either end, and you want to try and keep diagonal objects like that. They make for great compositional cues, but keep them just off the corners. If they can be a little bit in the frame, again, it makes for a more pleasing composition. This is a wild thing. There's a park in suburban Detroit called Kensington Park. The gift shop at the park actually sells wild bird food. You can put it in your hand, and the birds are so conditioned to humans, they'll fly up to you and land in your hand and peck the food out. I'm not really sure how I feel about this with wild birds, but they've been doing it for decades there, and it's just part of the thing that they do. But here I had a workshop attendee who'd gotten some bird seed, put it in his hand, and this little bird landed right in the hand and was pecking food out of it. And he was shooting with a wide angle lens, you know, from his standing position, getting some fun and unique shots too. So those sorts of things. Again, if you're doing backyard birds, use bird feeders. Don't get the birds so used to you that, this is my opinion, don't get the birds so used to you that they'll come right up to you. I think that's kind of messing with nature more than I want to. Again, deep, dark in the shade of the forest. This was ISO 1600, and this is also a 75% crop. And here's where a good sensor and a sharp lens are going to give you some benefit. I was shooting at 400 millimeters, but this woodpecker was still a good distance away from me. I didn't want to step off of the footpath in the park. This is at that Kensington Park in Detroit also. And again, I had to just finally crop and post. Now at that high ISO, I didn't nail my color balance either. So I didn't quite get the color totally natural, but it's acceptable. And I just want to throw this in to show you that high ISO, if you're using a good sharp lens and a fairly modern camera, you're going to get some noise, but you can still get sharp pictures even if you have to crop. And like I say, this is about a 75% crop. So a lot going on here to get the shot and put it in the presentation. Now, another thing, take advantage of the technology that's in most of our lenses or camera bodies nowadays, and use stabilization if you have to. This is a handheld shot at 400 millimeters, about 20 or 30 minutes after sunset one afternoon. You're starting to get into that blue hour, which makes for beautiful light. But the light values drop incredibly fast. So here I was already down to at ISO 800 at 125th of a second. Now at 400 millimeters, if I didn't have a stabilized lens, it would have been a blurry picture, or I'd have had to get the monopod out, and by that time the hawk would have taken off. So stabilization got me a shot here that I wouldn't maybe have gotten otherwise. And the rule of thumb, if you have a non-stabilized lens, and there are those out there that aren't stabilized, you want to generally not go below the focal length of your lens in terms of shutter speed. So like with a 400 millimeter lens like this, I wouldn't want to go lower than a 400th of a second. Otherwise, again, motion induced from holding the lens or trying to hold the lens steady, it can end up giving you a blurry shot. So stabilization can give you 1, 2, 3, and with a couple of Tamron lenses, up to 5 shutter speeds or 5 stops of handheld shake reduction. So again, technology is just amazing. Tamron didn't invent stabilization, but I think our engineers really perfected it. We're the only company that's currently able to deliver in 3 lenses right now 5 stops of stabilization. It's just unheard of. If you do see 3 and 4 stop stabilization, it may well be that other companies, because Tamron is a tech company, we license some of our technology to other companies. You may have Tamron DNA inside your lens, even if you don't own a Tamron lens. And some of those tech things come out as stabilization that other people have said, hey, rather than trying to reinvent it, we'll buy the technology. So again, that's a good thing for the whole industry. Another thing we had happen last year, last November down in Bosque, the first 2 days, it rained cats and dogs for 2 straight days. And the result was people weren't getting any bird photos because the birds were all huddled up and hiding out and weren't flying much. And you know, folks were frustrated. And by day 3, I got up. It was my morning to get out before sunrise and do a workshop. And we ended up, I looked out my window at 4 in the morning and it was foggy because it had been raining for 2 days and then it cleared off. So I thought this is going to make for some challenging but very rewarding photography. So by the time we got out to the site and started shooting, the light levels were coming up. But I was explaining to the workshop attendees, you're going to have magic light here. Don't be angry because you're not going to get the sharp bird pictures. Tomorrow's going to be another day and you're going to be able to get sharp images. And I could hear people at other groups around us going, man, I've been here for 3 days and I can't get a good sharp picture. And it's going to happen, but take advantage of those misty mornings, those foggy mornings. You get absolutely beautiful, fantastic light. The birds, because it's darker, because of the fog, until the fog lifts, the birds are going to hang around longer on the ground. So again, I was able to get some interesting shots of these sandhills as they were just slowly plodding along through the field here, looking for something to nibble on the ground. And eventually the fog lifted. This was ISO 32 at a 1/100th of a second on the monopod again at 600 millimeters f6.1. Or 7.1, so almost wide open, and just interesting light. Now the sandhills wait to take off. The snow geese took off first as the fog lifted, so I was able to get, again, some interesting shots. Now you're going to have to, in low contrast light like this, you're going to have to manually focus. So again, practice manual focusing with your lenses so that you're comfortable with that when you get out in the field too. And in lower light and in low contrast light, manual focus is going to be an absolute must. And then we drove around the wildlife reserve a little bit, and a couple of hours later we actually found where the snow geese went to kind of forage for the day for their eating. And again, the fog had kind of moved back in for a few minutes, and I got this neat shot of the birds coming in for a landing. Now we talk about the rule of thirds. You notice they are in the right hand third of the frame, and that I saw them landing, I saw the setup, I saw the birds on the ground already as an anchor, and again I intentionally composed that way. Don't be afraid of wide angle lenses either. I had just gotten a pre-release copy of the 24 millimeter prime lens for Sony full frame mirrorless, and I was kind of stealthily shooting that with my already released lenses, and got this great shot of, again, some sandhills taking off into the fog, and I have that nice anchor of the foreground, the birds on the left, and the big tree on the right. So again, look for those compositional cues, but don't be afraid to shoot some wide angle shots as well as your telephoto shots. Don't put the camera away in bad weather. This was at a state park of about 30 minutes from my house on the last snow day of the year about 3 weeks ago. Yes, it was snowing in Colorado as recently as 3 weeks ago. And the week before that, we got a foot at my house. But I needed to socially distance myself from my house for the day because we've been cooped up. And I thought, yeah, let's go see what's happening at the park. And this fellow was, again, I don't know whether it's a male or a female, but it was foraging around near the shore and hopped, from one part of the shoreline to the other part of the shoreline, and I caught it in the air. So that's fun to think about. Again, this is ISO 1600. Fairly bright day. I was at a 1,000th of a second at f18, and you'll still notice that there's pretty short depth of field. The water below the bird and in the background is still fairly indistinct. So that's something to consider. And then wrapping it up, just for fun, the other night I went out to play with really high ISO. Now this is straight out of the camera. This is a JPEG out of my camera, my D500, at ISO 12,800, handheld at 125th of a second at 600 millimeters. And you'll notice it's noisy, but it's also very artistic. I think I may fine tune this one just a smidgen, and it's going to end up printed and matted and framed on my walls one of these days. And then to take it to a huge extreme, this is ISO 40,000, really. And again, not a lot of noise because they're, again, relatively low contrast scene. So experiment with your camera just to see how high an ISO you can realistically shoot with. Now, even that previous shot at 12,800, I'm not going to make a big print. And with ISO 40,000, you're going to start seeing that noise enlarging pretty fast if you make a print. But I just wanted to see how far I could stretch my camera. Also, again, Tamron stabilization, handheld, 1/40th of a second at 600 millimeters. That's in mode 3 stabilization on that lens. We have 3 modes that I can explain later if folks want me to go over. But that's about 4.5 stops of stabilization is what that provides in that lens. So just absolutely amazing. Again, have some fun, maybe go out and shoot the high-flying birds. There are a number of apps you can get for your phone that will tell you, for instance, when the International Space Station is coming over. So that streak of light on the camera left there is the space station going over, and that's how far it traveled in 30 seconds at 12,500 miles an hour, 150 or so miles above the surface. The next little streak below that, I'm pretty sure was a little meteor. And then below that, you can see kind of a dotted light. That was a plane flying way off in the distance, and its marker lights were blinking. Now that dome of light you see at the bottom of the frame, I'm out in northeastern Colorado. I was looking back towards Cheyenne, Wyoming. Cheyenne had that big a dome of light over it. And then on the lower left-hand corner, 2+ hours after sunset, and that's still how much light it looked pitch black to me, but that's how much light my camera picked up off the horizon from the 2-hour previously set sun. Again, bear that in mind. Now, I was originally out pointing the camera the other direction, looking at the Milky Way coming up. But again, play with those different kinds of things when you're out in the field. Don't put the camera away after dark, and get out early. You're going to get neat things. One more tool I like to recommend before I wrap things up is a polarizing filter, especially if you're around water. It's going to kill a lot of the reflections, just like polarized sunglasses would if you don't have a polarizer for your lenses. Again, the folks at Calagaz can explain what's going to work best for your lens and shooting needs, and there are generally different price grades. I make a living at photography. This was made with a polarizing filter that at the time I bought it retailed for over $400. Polarizers, as most other things in consumer photography, have gotten more affordable, and you can get great polarizers for a lot less than that now. But you can use it to reduce glare off of water, sand, grasses, rocks, anything but metal. And it works best at a right angle of the sun, kind of keep the sun over your shoulder. You're going to increase the contrast between the clouds and the sky, so the clouds are going to be more distinct and the sky is going to look darker. Just a great tool for outdoor photography, especially midday and especially if you're around water. Now, bear in mind, you lose 1.5 to 2 stops, about 1 2/3 if you're at max polarization, maybe more. One of the polarizers I now own has also 4 stops of neutral density built in. I use it mostly for landscape photography because I can slow the shutter speed down even more for certain applications. But polarizers can be a great tool for your outdoor shooting. Again, I'm Tamron Tech Jeff, and we'll open it up for questions. And again, thank you so much to our hosts at Calagaz for inviting us over today and having our little chit chat for the afternoon.
Thank you, Jeff, for that great presentation. I think there was a lot of good, useful information in there for everybody that's in the presentation today, whether they own Tamron lenses or not. And that's one thing that we greatly appreciate about all you guys over there at Tamron, with the presentations that you do in person, with these webinars, and also the content that you mentioned earlier through the website and the newsletters. That, of course, you would love for everybody to own and shoot a Tamron lens, but you all always provide some very good content for just photography in general that's relevant to everybody and what they can use. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for the kind words. It's all about getting better pictures, and even if you don't own Tamron lenses, you probably have similar lenses in your camera bag, and most all of these techniques are going to apply universally, regardless of what you pull out of the bag and put on your camera. So that's the most important thing. I'm a photographer. I want to share my love of photography and help you get a little bit better if I can.
So we've had a lot of great questions come through in the chat during the presentation. I've got a few that I'm going to ask you directly, but just want to
Sure.
remind everybody that's in here with us, if you have a question you'd like to get addressed by Jeff, go ahead and put that in the chat and I'll add it on to my list. But we'll just go ahead and get started going down with these. Real quick, the first one is you were mentioning the education reference materials from Tamron and the sources for that. Can you just real quick go over where to find those again?
Sure. Go to the Tamron USA website, and this is important, tamron-usa.com. And when you get on the landing page, you'll need to either scroll down to the bottom or just, I don't have it up in front of me right now, but click on the, I think, lenses page, and it'll show you all of our lenses. And then if you scroll down, it'll have like the subscription to the newsletter that I mentioned. And a new feature, it's kind of prominently featured, is our Tamron Homeschool. And again, we have a lot of our webinar content is there, tutorials, how-tos, it's all free. And we, other than for subscribing to the newsletter, we don't even ask you for your email or anything. So you can be anonymous. We're not going to steal or sell your information in any way. So a lot of good tips and techniques, not only from the Tamron Tech team, but also from the Tamron Image Masters and Tamron Ambassadors. We have a whole team of photographers around the country and from around the world who are sharing their talents and techniques. So we have wildlife photographers, we have nature photographers, we have portrait photographers, and just about any topic you can think about, we probably have some educational material there to help you learn and again, be a little entertained, I hope, and just be a better photographer.
Awesome, thank you for that. So now we're going to get into some of the questions for the actual photography part of it.
Sure.
One of the great questions that came in was, do you prefer telephoto prime lenses or zoom lenses? Kind of an either or situation there, and what's your preference? And then also trying to use teleconverters with wildlife and bird photography.
Okay, well, I'll kind of answer those in the order you asked them. I use almost entirely zooms in telephotos. Now, part of that is because Tamron only makes telephoto zooms. We don't have a prime we don't have any long primes right now. Test reports have proven over the years that you don't necessarily need to own a prime lens in terms of getting sharp images. Now, prime zooms or prime telephotos, fixed focal lengths, may give you one big advantage, and that's going to be speed. Our 150 to 600 at 600 is f6.3. If you want to make the investment and carry it with you, there are, there's 600 millimeter f4 lenses. There's 400 millimeter 2.8s, and you can get fast, long lenses. The downside is they're big, they're heavy, and plan on trading in your car for one because they're not inexpensive. So Tamron's goal is to make great lenses that are going to give you fantastic images at an affordable price. And if you've got the resources and you're serious about it, yeah, some of those fast primes might be a great investment for you. But for hobbyists and even a lot of working pros I know have given up those big heavy lenses and come to zooms because of the versatility and the size and weight savings. Next, teleconverters. Tamron makes a couple of match teleconverters that are for just our telephoto lenses, and they're for 4 specific lenses. They work with the 150 to 600, the 100 to 400, the 70 to 210 f4, and the 70 to 200 2.8. We make a 1.4 times and a 2 times, and there are a couple of pros and a couple of cons to teleconverters. They give you more magnification. You're going to lose a little bit of contrast, and you're going to lose light. The 1.4, you're going to lose 1 stop of light, so your shutter speed drops by 1 speed, or you have to open up the lens 1 stop, or you have to go 1 stop higher on your ISO. The 2 times converter, 2 stops. Also, a lot of camera bodies aren't capable of maintaining autofocus with that additional light loss that's caused by adding the teleconverter. And this is true of not just Tamron teleconverters. This is any brand of teleconverter that you want to, attempt to put on your camera. You're likely going to lose autofocus. You're going to lose some contrast, a little bit of sharpness. And if they're inexpensive teleconverters, because they are out there. Tamron used to make inexpensive teleconverters. You're going to lose image quality. So there are some downsides to that. And the third part of the question was, let's see, what was the third part?
I think it was just 2-part.
Okay.
So prime versus zoom, and then the teleconverters.
Yeah. Okay. So got that.
Then moving into some camera setting things. When you're shooting birds in flight or wildlife, do you prefer shutter priority, aperture priority, or taking full control with the camera in manual mode?
If it's the middle of the day and the light's not going to change, I don't mind going to full manual mode, but I am generally, if I'm shooting fast moving subjects, I'm in shutter priority, because that's the main thing I want to control. I want to control my shutter speed. If I'm shooting more of the landscape kind of thing, like early morning, late afternoon, where I'm doing those wide angle shots, then I will go to aperture priority, because I may need or want to control depth of field, and that's my primary goal. The one thing about shooting manual now is if you want to choose a particular shutter speed aperture combination, and you need to maintain that even if the lighting conditions are changing, most newer cameras also allow you to go into the menu and choose auto ISO. And this is something relatively new. I've started to use it when I do manual exposure shooting, where I've got to maintain a shutter speed aperture combination for the shooting situation. And that allows the camera to go automatic with the ISO, and it'll move it up and down a little bit as the lighting conditions change too. So that's a helpful, relatively new thing in your camera bag that you may not even be aware your camera offers. Again, check your owner's manual or go to your body maker's social pages or website for better tutorial information there. But it's a handy new thing. And I know a lot of wildlife photographers I know where it's mission critical to get the shot have gone to, again, manual shutter speed, aperture, but auto ISO. And it's just a new tool for you to use.
And it's good timing bringing back up into the auto ISO and the question on there, because another great question was, what should you be aiming for as kind of your highest acceptable ISO or noise level in your image for print purposes and also for digital display purposes?
Well, as I mentioned, and I kind of touched on this earlier, I recommend to take your particular camera out, like I own, let's see, 6 different digital cameras that I use regularly. And, some of them are company provided and some of them are my own. But I went out with each of my cameras and shot a series of shots at different ISOs. Now, a couple of my older cameras, I simply don't trust them at over ISO 800. So I keep those for bright light situations or where I'm doing, if I'm doing night skies, I'll just keep them at a low ISO and do star trails with them. The newer cameras, I can expect, and what I did was I just shot like 100, 400, 800, and then I went to 1600, 3200, and like you saw in those last couple of examples before we came back to the question and answer, just for fun the other night, I went out and shot at ISO 40,000. I'm probably not going to make a print from that, but the camera is capable of it, and the image wasn't, the image was sharp, but it was noisy. And the one before that, even at 12,800, because it was slightly underexposed, the bird was, kind of in a shadow area. Again, I don't think I would go that high, but most newer cameras, you can at least go to 16 or 3200, but go out, shoot some stuff and make some 8x10s and see just what you're comfortable with, and see what they look like on your monitor to see if you're happy with the results there. So there's no one pat answer. It's really going to depend upon your comfort level with noise. Now, again, I go back to photojournalism where when I was shooting news photos in the 70s and 80s, the fastest black and white film speed I could buy was 400. So we had to manipulate it and underexpose it. And we would go to 1600 and 3200, bring it back to the darkroom, overdevelop it, and it made grain like crazy, which is what's equivalent to digital noise now. But again, at 60 dots per inch at a newspaper, it still made acceptable looking photos. But I would never make 8x10s out of those images. They don't hold up. And now with digital, we can go to stupid high ISOs compared to what I was used to back in the day and still get fantastic results. So again, go out and experiment with your system and see what's going to work best in your workflow.
Yeah, that's one thing I teach in our digital basics class, is that the number one answer to the photography question of what's the best settings to use, that number one answer is it depends.
Yep.
It depends on what your end goal is, and also depends on the gear that you're using. Because if your camera's maximum ISO level is 6400, then 6400 ISO on your camera is going to be pretty noisy and grainy. But if you have a newer camera and your maximum ISO is at 25,000 or 52,000, then shooting at 6400 ISO is going to be a completely different game and experience for you. So like Jeff said, it's really a factor of going out and testing what's acceptable to you with the gear that you have. And that's the great thing about digital, is once you've made that investment of your camera and your lenses, it doesn't cost us anything to go out and take images. You know, it's completely free at that point. You can go shoot 1,000 pictures on your camera just to experiment with how different things are going to come out. And the only thing that costs you is your time.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that's worth investing in, check your owner's manual, or again with the folks at the store, and see. One of the things I've invested in is high write speed memory cards, and this is critical when you are out there shooting long bursts of frames. You know, your camera will run into what they call a memory buffer, and the camera will start to shoot more slowly because it's writing to the card. So always pair up. What I recommend to do is buy the fastest card you can get for your camera's capabilities, or maybe buy an even faster card, knowing that someday you might get a camera that writes faster. So I went out and bought all high write speed cards, so that as I'm firing those bursts, click, 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 and I can shoot 10, 15, 20 frames before the camera and the cards start to slow down. I used to have a camera, pretty modern camera, made by a major brand Nikon, I didn't say that out loud, manufacturer, that it advertised 6 frames a second. And I thought, well, for the price point of the camera, that's great. I can afford that. And I bought the fastest card that they recommended for it. And it would shoot 6 frames a second in theory, but I shoot RAW and JPEG. And that takes up a lot of resources inside the camera's brain. And I could shoot 3 or 4 frames and I'd get that 6 frame burst, but it would go click, 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 click as the memory buffer kicked in. So, you know, again, newer cameras perform at that better, but, you know, just like your tripod, buy the best tripod you can afford. I have probably 3 tripods in my closet that I use for various things. That I don't have a Rolex, but my kids are going to fight over those tripods when I go to the great dark room of the sky. And, you know, invest in good equipment, and invest in, you know, the best you can get at the time, and it's going to last you longer. And memory cards, a good tripod, a good sturdy tripod. Now, again, I have several tripods. I carry lightweight tripods when I travel, but I know I can't extend them out as much, or I'm going to have vibration in my shots. You know, when I know I can work out of the trunk of my car, I take the big beast. If I know I'm going to be throwing it in my suitcase and traveling to my next workshop event, I don't carry as big or heavy a tripod. So it stays lower to the ground. The legs don't come all the way out. The center column never comes up, because that's a wiggle point, or a wobble point, if you will. And again, even the best compact tripods aren't going to be as stable as the beefy ones. So again, you may end up investing in more than one too.
Okay. I'm going to field a question real quick, and then we have a couple more. Now, one general photography, and another one that's a little bit more specific to Tamron.
Sure.
But Gail just asked a question of many folks shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time, and why. Well, Gail, the reason for that is so that you have the benefit of the RAW file. So if you need to edit that image and make changes and adjustments to color or exposure, you have the the most detail in that file to be able to make those changes, while also having the benefit of having the JPEG immediately that can be uploaded to social media or shared in whatever format that you want to share that in. Don't have to worry about taking it into Photoshop or another image processing software.
Yep.
But when you're shooting wildlife and anything in a continuous format, unless your camera is really fast and unless you have a really fast memory card, I would recommend picking either RAW or JPEG, because if you have both of those file types going at the same time, it's going to fill that camera buffer up much faster. And like what he was just talking about with the 6 frames per second, only lasting for 1 or 2 seconds before the buffer caught up, you're going to be much likelier to run into that if you're shooting RAW and JPEG at the same time.
Yeah. And you may not need both RAW and JPEG for your workflow, again, because I do that social media sharing and I want those big files in case I need to do something special with an image. I have all the data that the camera records. A RAW file records basically every pixel on your camera's imaging sensor. A JPEG will only record, the best quality JPEG is usually only about 1/4 of that, about 25% of the data that the camera is capable of recording. So it's a huge difference in what you can do with a finished file too.
And then, so this is kind of a technique question. When you're shooting birds in flight, do you prefer to use that shutter button to activate your autofocus, or are you changing it up to use a rear button or a back button focusing to activate autofocus?
I know a lot of people love back button focus. I've just never gotten used to it. So I'm just, I stab away at the top button, and that way, I know the sensitivity of the button, and I know when I can lock or engage focus, and then and how much further to press. Back button focus, it forces me to have to do 2 things, and it's, again, I'm getting older. It's sometimes if I use back button focus, I don't remember to fire the shutter, or it's like everything else, getting familiar with the camera and what you're used to. I know a lot of photographers swear by back button focus. Personally, and again, this is personally, just never been a huge fan.
And then another great Tamron specific question is, so
Sure.
you have the different VC modes on like the 150 to 600 G2.
Sure.
Can you go through what those are, 1, 2, 3?
Yeah, and this is also on the 70 to 200 2.8. Mode 1 is our standard stabilization. That'll give you about 3, maybe 3.5 stops of shake reduction. And you see what happens. You see that shake reduction happen in the viewfinder. So when you activate the autofocus, again, you'll see the lens kind of lock on to the subject, and it'll kind of float. So the stabilization, is performing. And that's for everyday shooting. That's what I use. Mode 2, again, is that panning mode. So if I'm on my gimbal head, or if I'm following, race cars or sports where everything is pretty much on a flat plane, I'll use the panning mode, and it turns off the up and down component, but it gives me more stability left to right. And then mode 3 is kind of Tamron's secret weapon. This is where on the 150 to 600, I can get 4.5 stops. I can get 5 stops out of the 70 to 200, and you don't see the stabilization happen in the viewfinder, so it's a little less comfortable to work with if your handheld. Takes a little more concentration, because you're going to see all that wobble and shake as you're holding the lens and firing the shot, but it's going to give you that maximum stabilization. And if you're forced to have to shoot handheld in a grab shot situation, it's going to give you that extra bump in maybe getting a sharp shot where you wouldn't have with a less powerful stabilizer.
Great. And that is pretty much all the questions we've worked through there. So
okay.
I'm going to say thank you again for giving us your time today. And anybody that's watching right now, remember right there behind them, you can see all the ways to follow Jeff on social media. It's very simple. It's Tamron Tech Jeff on everything. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. In the chat, I put our social media accounts there as well. On Facebook, we're really easy to get to. It's facebook.com/Calagaz. And Instagram is just @Calagaz Photo. We would love you for you to tag us in any of the images that you create, especially with stuff that you've purchased from our stores, so we can see what you're out there accomplishing and capturing, and that we've been able to help you with. Later this afternoon, we will have a recording of today's webinar go out. And so you'll be able to rewatch this if you want to go back and catch any other parts or view any of the slides again. And that's going to stay up for you to have access to, just moving forward perpetually. And I also want to say you spent a little bit of time, Jeff, talking about polarizers. And that is a great opportunity right now because Tamron and ProMaster have teamed up for the last couple of months, and this continues on into the month of June, that there are a number of lenses available at the moment right now that you get not only an instant savings discount from Tamron, but you also receive a free ProMaster HGX Prime circular polarizer filter, which is one of the best quality polarizing filters on the market right now. So you can get up to $100 off on the lens by itself and also receive up to a $200 filter completely free. So
Exactly.
if you have any interest in that or want to find out some more information, give us a call, stop by and see us, or you can send us an email at info@calagaz.com, and that goes straight to me, and I can help you get your questions answered there.
Yeah, and I use that ProMaster filter. It's the real deal. It's fantastic image quality. Like the coatings on the Tamron lenses, it has a special coating that repels water and oil and dust. It's very easy to keep clean. Older multi-coated polarizers used to be a nightmare. You get a little smudge on them, and you'd have to go through a whole process to get the smudge off and the oils without just spreading it out all over the filters. So these, I think they call it Repelmax.
Yeah, it's a Repelmax coating.
Yeah, that's a great coating. And Tamron on most of our newest lenses uses what's called a fluorine coating, which does the same thing. And again, just technology making our lives easier.
Yeah, it's a very high quality product and a super value to be something that you can receive as an included purchase item. So I'm going to give Leo a chance to close us out. Anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, here again, I want to thank Jeff. I think he did a great job today.
Thank you.
I can tell by the number of people that stayed on the call too. That's very interesting to see that you held everybody's attention throughout the call. So
great.
Kudos goes to you. So, and thank everybody for showing up today. As Aaron said in the beginning, we've got 2 dates tentative for 2 more seminars in the month of June. So on different topics, those haven't been determined as of yet. I also want to tell everybody that, we are open part-time right now at both Mobile and Pensacola from 12 to 5 on Monday through Friday. We're doing our best as far as having make sure we're having social distancing. We're letting people only partially into the store. We're having hand sanitizers all over the place. We would request that you wear a mask, but if you happen not to have a mask, we do have those masks available for you too, because we do require a mask when you're looking at any photo equipment, especially lenses, cameras, flashes, etc. So, and hopefully as this progresses, we look at it week by week to see when our hours will change and we will open up more. But quite honestly, right now, we're trying to do our best to protect us and protect our customers as they come in also. So, so thank you very much again. And I think we'll go ahead and close this meeting out. Thank you, Jeff.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. And again, shop local, everybody. It's you're doing your neighborhood and your community a real solid by shopping locally. Prices now are the same in the local stores as they are on the internet. There's no reason not to keep the dollars in your community where they're going to do the most good.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Make sure you follow us on social media so you can find out about those June classes when we get them official. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.